Well, it says we're live, but I'm looking at us on the app, and it doesn't agree.
That's
so somehow, some way. Oh, yeah, look. There we go.
Hey.
I don't know how that happened. I guess maybe the link.
Yeah, just a little delayed reaction. That's fine. We're both delayed here.
Maybe everyone will see that the tab has turned live. I don't know. I'm hopeful. This is the first time we've ever done this, so you knew my efficiency with it was going to be kind of in the sink.
So be kind, is what we're asking. A little bit of leniency.
Maybe we should have tried this out first. I don't know. Something like that.
That's no fun.
Good evening to James McNeil joining us all the way from Scotland. I'm not even going to attempt to say the name of that town because I will be laughed off the international stage. This is like that time I showed up in England and I thought it was Towcester and I was laughed at and they were like, "No, you idiot, it's toaster." I was like, "Yeah," because I definitely would have figured that out.
Yeah, it's kind of like Chapatoulas.
Chocolopolis.
Yeah, Chocolopolis. Yeah.
Oh, goodness. Well, this is exciting. This is fun. We've got a great guest joining us, and I'm not going to waste any time. I'm going to go ahead and switch us over to the 3-panel format and bring on our guest, Norma Graham, to talk First Canadian Para.
Hey, guys. How you doing?
Doing great.
I mean, honestly, Norma's the person they're here to see. They see enough of you and I, Joey. Plenty.
We're both parroting.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Nice. Now, granted, it's First Airborne, but hey, it all comes out together. It all comes out.
They're all the band of brothers, after all.
And the good guys. So we'll take it.
She said it.
She said it. She said the thing. She said the band of brothers thing. There it is. Oh my goodness. Well, we are glad to have you, and excited to talk about. I think everybody on this podcast, Bo, has heard me drone on ad nauseum about British Airborne. So it might be fun to talk about an airborne unit that isn't British first, and second, what a great way to close out Canada at War Week.
Yeah.
Well, I just think it's wonderful that you've done this because, as you pointed out with Mike Bechtold, I nag a lot.
But it worked.
Canadians, to remember the Canadians. We were there. We were on Juno Beach. We were everywhere. We were in Burma. I mean, we were there for everything. So I really appreciate you doing this this Canadians at War Week.
Absolutely. And it was really fun because I think we get to stretch our legs on something that we don't really get to talk a whole lot, which is World War I. So that was really fascinating. And
yeah,
I thought Brad's episode was really, really informative. I felt like I learned a lot.
And it's funny because right before the episode went live, Joey informed me that somebody wrote a whole diatribe of something. But if we've learned anything, especially from J.D. Hewitt over there at the History Underground, sometimes we can make fun of those YouTube comments from time to time. So hopefully that's something that we can do later on. But Norma, let's talk about 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion. So what are the early days of 1st Canadian Para look like?
Well, before we start, you got a slideshow for me, right? Yes.
Okay. There it is.
Before I start talking about it, I want to say my thank yous because I am learning as I go. I'm a retired librarian, and there's a pretty steep learning curve when you're trying to become a military historian in your 60s. So I want to first of all say thank you to these fine people that have helped me out with this project, and especially thank you to you guys for letting me come on and talk about it. So next slide. So 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion was formed in 1942. The idea was first put forward in 1940, but Canadian National Defence Headquarters refused to consider it. Canada had been doing little in the interwar period to ensure the military was capable of fighting a modern war. The horrific losses of the Great War and the economic desperation of the Depression were barriers too great to convince the government to allocate funds to the military. But in 1942, there was a change of heart. It was, I guess they were catching up with the fact that the Americans were doing it, the British were doing it, and maybe it was time we got on board. So the call went out to currently serving volunteers who had at least done their basic training to join the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion. And this is an actual photograph of the call going out, which it's a little scanty on details, but succinct.
Just screening. Just do it.
Yeah. The screening was very tough. Only about 1 in 3 applicants made it to the battalion, and the training was even tougher. So about 50% of those that tried to get in and were able to stay in. Anyone who didn't make the grade was RTU'd, which was returned to unit. The examiners were looking for men who were aggressive, introverted, and very self-confident. So the man who later led the battalion, Jeff Nicklin, was a star player for the Winnipeg Blue Bombers football team. And another, Fraser Eady, had been a top-notch hockey player who had turned down a chance to go professional with the Chicago Blackhawks in order to enlist. Some veterans recalled that they wanted to be with the best. They wanted this challenge. And others said, well, I saw a friend of mine that had joined up, and boy, that uniform would look pretty spiffy. So I joined up too. But they were very young, So their reasons for joining varied. So for recruits still in Canada, the training was to take place at Fort Benning in Georgia. An agreement was made between the government of Canada and Washington. And then later on, a training camp was set up in Shiloh, Manitoba. Recruits that were already serving in England, they trained at Ringway. So the first Canberra included Indigenous Canadians, Black Canadians, Asian Canadians, first and second generation immigrants from all over Europe. And that diversity was actually one of the greatest strengths, which is why I've put this quote on here from Fraser Eady, that the linguistic diversity actually worked out really well for them. So next slide. The training was very demanding, both physically and mentally. One reason for this is that the paratroopers needed to be able to achieve their objectives as a company, as a platoon, small groups, as individuals. With parachute battalions, you can, you never know if you're going to be able to go into action as a group. So, you have to be able to function in any sort of configuration.
Mm-hmm.
They also needed to have almost superhuman stamina, as they discovered during the Battle of Normandy, where they went days and nights without sleep. If you couldn't keep up, you were RTU'd.
Mm-hmm. Norma, I was going to ask, is their training very similar to the rest of kind of British or American, which is it more similar to, British or American airborne training? Because we know airborne in the U.S., they're flying, what is it? I think it's 5 jumps and then they're in, they're good. Right. They're paratroopers. Yeah. In the British airborne, there's a lot of static jumps.
It depended on where they trained, right? So if they were training in Fort Benning, they trained in the American style. Then when they got to Britain, well, that's the next slide, actually. So
that was just good timing.
Yeah, it really was. So since Canada did not have the extensive infrastructure that would be needed for a parachute battalion, the Canadian battalion was offered to and gratefully accepted by 6th Airborne in England. In the summer of 1943, they shipped out. They had to do more jump training at Ringway for the men that were coming from Canada because they'd been trained in the American style and would henceforward need to follow the British standards for jumping. So they continued weapons and tactics training at their base in Bulford, Carter Barracks in Bulford in Wiltshire. So Windy Gale, Sir Richard Gale, who was the led 6th Airborne, said nice things about them. He said, "I inspected the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion today. Any man with 2 eyes in his head could not fail to see that here is a fine battalion with all the makings of something magnificent." It is, but I kind of winkle out of that statement. They've got a ways to go. They have the makings, but they're not quite there yet. And it's true. Yeah. They needed a lot more training, and especially in the British style. So next slide. The best bit of luck that these Canadian boys had was to be placed in 3rd Brigade under the command of Brigadier James Hill. There could not possibly have been a better commanding officer for a group of Canadians. Hill was tough but fair. He was courageous to a fault, and he led from the front. So he was someone that the Canadians could respect. With Canadians, you don't get respect automatically. You got to earn it. Well, he earned it all the time.
And too, I wanted to ask, because I'm just going to kind of fire away with questions as we go.
Absolutely. Yeah, sure.
I was going to ask, thinking about leadership styles, and these are highly trained, highly motivated soldiers, and they need highly trained, highly motivated officers to lead them. Mm-hmm. You can't have somebody whose ambition in life is to work behind a desk in command of paratroopers. So what's the kind of the general morale and leadership style that we see coming out of Canada and into 6th Airborne when the Canadians make it over?
Well, for James Hill, he loved the Canadians, and they loved him back. And love is not too strong a term for it. Mm-hmm. He said himself that, of course, I loved the Canadians. The reason I had a grip on them was that I loved them. If you love people you're commanding and leading, they always reciprocate. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, there are some military leaders in the Second World War who commanded through fear. Mm-hmm. And you don't get the best out of, as you say, highly motivated troops by just scaring them half to death. Mm-hmm. He was like a father to them. If your father was somebody who made you jump out of an airplane. But
Joe, if you're watching, don't get any good ideas.
Yeah. He knew that they felt kind of orphaned because they were away from Canada. They had very little contact with other Canadians, almost none. They served with British, and so he knew that other than their pay and their uniforms, they had no contact with the Canadian high command or anything. They were part of British. So it was brilliant that Gale gave them to a man who could handle them with care and with love, but also respect.
Yeah,
I would say.
And that's also
does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Well, that's got to be tough, too. I mean, especially because like you've already mentioned, is that the 1st Canadian Para has American training, and they are under the leadership of British command, and also paratroopers are sort of a new concept, in World War II militarism, right? Because paratroopers, and which is it's funny. When I was getting ready for this live episode, I thought about a buddy of mine. A buddy of mine was he's retired now, but he was part of an airborne battalion. And he said, I don't know what officer convinced me that jumping out of a perfectly good airplane, I don't know who convinced me of that, but he needs to be, brought down a peg, because I'm like, why am I jumping out of this perfectly good aircraft? So I can imagine for, Brigadier Hill that this is, because it is tough, to lead with love, because that also makes the loss of, his men even more brutal.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I did want to put up this comment here from James. Troops need to have confidence in their leaders and trust them not to waste their lives. I mean, that really strikes right at the point of an allied effort in the war.
Yeah. Through Normandy, through the Ardennes, through Operation Varsity, Brigadier Hill was always a strong role model and a good friend to his Canadians. One of the veterans said later, in the line of attack, you could always find the brigadier at your elbow. He was always at the front. He was totally without fear. He's what I always imagined as a great leader. So, as I say, that was just such a lucky thing, because if they ended up with somebody who looked down on them, condescended to them, treated them like they were just colonials, it would not have gone well. They would not have performed well.
Hard to imagine them getting on with like a Hicks or a Hackett as their brigadier. So Hill seems to have worked out. What else can we talk about? Let's keep going.
Yeah,
we kind of rabbit holed here with James Hill.
Sorry.
There's a lot to talk about.
Well, he's extraordinary. So the airborne part of Operation Overlord, D-Day, was called Operation Tonga. And as part of 6th Airborne, the Canadians were some of the very first on the ground on that day. In fact, some of them actually landed right before midnight on June 5th. So they were some of the first boots on the ground. They were given several vital tasks to achieve around their drop zone east of the Orne River, and they were the furthest east of anybody. The 6th Airborne. So they were just inland from Sword Beach, and their job was to basically interdict the Germans that were inland from coming down to the beach to attack the men that were coming in on boats. So they were to blow up bridges. They were supposed to guard the flank of their 9th Battalion at the Merville Battery, and then taking over a German garrison and communications center at Varaville. And then they were supposed to all rendezvous at Le Mesnil Crossroads. They were really well organized and ready to take on the Nazis. Unfortunately, 6th Airborne drop was a bit of a shit show.
Yeah.
Due to several factors, the drop was widely scattered. Men came down all over the place, in some cases many miles from their rendezvous point. Some were dropped in flooded areas, and a few drowned due to the heavy loads of equipment that they were carrying. There was one guy, Private W.R. Kelly, came down. He was wedged in a tree branch over a flooded area with his head down. So his head was submerged in the water, and he had to keep lifting his head up out of the water to breathe. And just as he was, running out of energy, and was so exhausted, he was ready to give up, he was discovered and he was rescued. One of the medical officers, Colin Brebner, came down in a tree, and it was dark, right? It's middle of the night. Thinking he wasn't too far off the ground, he cut himself loose and fell about 40 feet and broke his pelvis and ended up being taken prisoner by the enemy. So 1st Canberra lost 70% of their very much needed weaponry and equipment. Wow. Remember, airborne troops are only able to carry light weapons, right? Bren guns, mortars, pistols, rifles. When they lost even most of that due to the leg bags. They had these leg bags that were supposed to let them down with a rope just before they landed. These leg bags were tearing open on the descent, and there went their guns right down into the dark. So many were left mostly weaponless and lost in the dark among an unseen enemy. Next slide. So here's these pictures I just got at the archives, the One Canberra archives in Petawawa Air Force or Army base in Northern Ontario, just this beginning of this week. So the battalion's A company was tasked to protect the left flank of 9th Battalion. That was under Colonel Otway when they took Murrayville Battery. B company was to blow up the Robomb Bridge, and you can see a picture of the Robomb Bridge there. Mm-hmm. That was a reconnaissance photo, aerial reconnaissance photo, and it was I think in March that they took that before D-Day. And C company was to secure the drop zone and then move to a big manor house near Veraville, which mm-hmm. was an enemy comm center and barracks. And that picture of the building there, that is that's the gatehouse of the chateau. So it looks pretty swanky, but that's the gatehouse. Anyway, and then the picture on the bottom is of the Murrayville Battery before it was even quite completed. And they had to take that out. 9th Battalion was tasked with taking that out. Neil Barber has written a brilliant book about that, the 9th Battalion's fight, called The Day the Doubles Dropped In, which I highly recommend if anybody's interested. So next
I just got up to grab Saul's book because I remembered that there was a whole section in there about their actions at D-Day. So yeah. There it is. Saul David, yet again, getting a great shout out on the podcast. Saul David needs to get on Homebrew History because I keep trying to get in touch with him and there's no way to do it. So
I know how to do it. Talk to me later.
There we go. Now we can do. Now we're in business, Norma.
Yep.
Okay. So next slide. Yes. Good. So despite a determined and aggressive enemy, the loss of equipment and having to achieve objectives with a fraction of the men that they had planned for, the battalion was able to fulfill their tasks. In fact, all of the battalions of 3rd Brigade were like, it's nothing short of miraculous. It was almost like a loaves and fishes moment where, there was supposed to be 150 guys to do something and there was 20, but they still pulled it off, which was amazing. They never retreated, abandoned, or lost ground that they had defended. Major General Windy Gale said, "It was a great day for us when the Canadian government deemed it fit to place the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion under my command. You know how magnificently that battalion has done." So these pictures here, the one of the guy he's kind of in a slit trench, is a picture of one of the One Canberra guys in Normandy, looking extremely tired. The first, 4 or 5 days, they had no sleep, and it was like really aggressive counterattacks coming from the Germans. So it was rough. And the one on the right is the aid post, a regimental aid post. It was set up at Le Mesnil Crossroads. And in the middle is the monument at Le Mesnil for One Canberra, the commemorative monument. They spent the whole summer in Normandy and were sent back to England in early September. And of the original 544 Canadians who jumped, only 197 returned. Wow. 83 killed, 187 wounded, 87 taken prisoner of war, mostly because of the scattered jump and some of them coming down like miles away. Mm-hmm. 8 received decorations for courage. So here we are back in Bulford, in September. They had a couple of weeks to rest up and relax, and then they were thrown back into training. Their Canadian commander, Colonel Bradbrook, he'd been a really good administrator, but when it came to fighting in Normandy, he wasn't as aggressive as what was expected, and he also was very rarely at the front. He wasn't up there with his men, unlike the brigadier who often was, and got grievously wounded on D-Day. So he managed to, he refused to be evacuated, but he was hurt. So Bradbrook was sent back to Canada and was replaced by Colonel Jeff Nicklin, and his second in command was Major Fraser Eady. So next slide. They didn't have a lot of downtime. Nicklin was a slave driver, but he was a slave driver because he wanted them to. I mean, they'd been through it now. He knew what it took to survive that kind of rigor. So he was hard on them because he needed them to be at the top of their game. But anyway, when they did have some downtime, they liked to visit the Rose and Crown pub in Bulford. And the pub has placed a plaque on the outside wall of the building to remind customers to this day to think of the Canadian boys that fought with the 6th Airborne.
Cheers
Isn't that lovely? A friend, an independent company friend, Joe, sent me this picture because that's his pub.
Once again, the bonds of the independent company, they grow stronger and stronger every day.
They do so. They do so. It's amazing. It's that somebody could write a PhD thesis about it, I swear. Okay, so the next slide. Now we're going to the Battle of the Bulge.
Which is, I want to jump in right here too.
Yeah. No,
Bo, this is, you and I, we did an episode a while back with Peter and talked about the Battle of the Bulge.
Ad nauseum.
For 2.5 hours almost. It was 2 episodes, and even then, I still have like the Eddie Murphy raw tape of that somewhere else. That was after Peter added a couple of Calvadoses and some Normandy 44s.
Normandy 44.
He was good. But then, too, even in my own research on the Bulge that I'm doing as part of my book on the Stevensons, on James Stevenson's War, as I got a little bit further and further into the Bulge, there's this massive kind of, it's the ideal American battle, right? Yeah. Because we're caught flat-footed, ambushed, and just it's true American grit and determination to hold on. And every time I read that, I go, yeah, but like Montgomery got command of First Army, and there were British troops there, and 6th Airborne was there. And so like it's an American battle in memory. And it is an American battle, I think, rightfully so, because it is really, we just listened to James Holland and Al Murray's podcast series that they did on the Bulge, and I just finished rereading. I want you to get that the rereading Snow and Steel.
Yeah,
because
okay,
so that I did it in under a year is pretty amazing. It's kind of like reading from the Bible. If you're going to be one of those people that says, I'm going to read the Bible every day, you'll eventually get to the end of it.
Eventually.
Peter's book is eventually you'll get to the end of it. But I came away with the same feeling, right? It's an American battle by identity. It's an American battle in memory, but it's an allied effort in actuality.
Yeah.
I think of it kind of like the Alamo, except you guys won eventually.
Eventually.
Well, hey, so did Hurley Fuller. He thought it was the Alamo in the Ardennes. Another great book by friend of the show, John McManus.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
We're making connections all throughout homebrew.
We're throwing them out there wherever we can.
Great time.
Shame of name dropping.
Yeah. Anyway, so when the Germans made their last ditch effort to win the war, Christmas 1944 in the Ardennes, it was the Americans, of course, who bore the brunt of the attacks.
Mhm.
But the British 6th Airborne, including 1 Canberra, the only Canadians to take part, were called upon to assist in driving back the enemy and protecting their American allies. Due to the weather problems that precluded flights, on December 26th, the paratroopers were loaded in ships and sent to Belgium. One disgruntled paratrooper remarked, "We were supposed to be paratroopers, and here we are being loaded into a damn boat." Fraser Eady, who at the time was second in command of the unit, understood that we were plugging a hole where the enemy had broken through. Most of what the unit ended up doing in the Bulge was reconnaissance, patrols, and freezing their asses off.
Mm-hmm.
It was brutally cold, and the urgency of the situation meant that there wasn't time to get the men properly kitted out in winter clothing. They were in the same battle dress as they'd been in Normandy the previous summer for the first little while.
You know, I'll wear a Denison smock anytime, but it is not good for cold.
Make it be chilly.
Sergeant Dennis Flynn said, "My prevalent memory of the Ardennes was that it was very cold. It seemed that wherever we were going was always colder than the place we just left." But the ever resourceful Canadians scrounged up some blankets and even a sewing machine and made boot covers, hoods, ponchos, and they even took sheets and made winter camouflage gear for their patrols. Now, this will be interesting to you, Joseph, if you're working on something to do with the Bulge. Interestingly, Fraser Eady recalled that, and this is a quote from him, "We were within about 15 kilometers of Bastogne, and some of us suggested we go in and help them out, help the Americans out. However, we were turned down by the Americans because they wanted an American unit to break in and do the rescue work."
Sounds about right.
Make of that what you will.
Mm-hmm.
It seems a little short-sighted, but what do I know?
Yeah.
So next slide.
Amy makes a great point here. Canadians know how to work with snow and ice.
Yeah. If there's anyone well equipped.
Amy, it doesn't mean we like it.
Admittedly,
Anyway.
You're better than anyone from Tennessee or Louisiana could be with ice. So
True.
Anyway, so one of the things that the veterans of 1 Canberra all remembered was the shock and the horror of discovering the massacre of civilians at Band in Belgium. 37 young boys and old men had been executed and their bodies thrown in a bombed-out cellar in retribution for the townspeople welcoming the Allies. So the Allies had come in, the townspeople were ecstatic, then the Allies got driven out again, and the Germans took revenge. Brigadier Hill and Jeff Nicklin had the men file past the bodies to imprint on them just what monstrous actions the enemy was capable of. And they never forgot. So James Hill said, "Now this is the kind of people you're fighting." In February of 1945, the battalion was sent back to England to prepare for their next role. They wouldn't have long to wait. Operation Varsity, March 24th, bouncing the Rhine. Next slide. In an unusual twist to the usual story, for Operation Varsity, the airborne troops would be dropped in daytime. After the ground troops had made their first surge across the River Rhine, the hope was that the enemy would be distracted by the ground troops so that the airborne could land at their rear and surprise them. 6th Airborne's Major General Eric Bowles announced, "Well, gentlemen, you'll be glad to know that this time we're not going to be dropped down as a carrot held out for the ground forces. Army and Navy are going to storm across the Rhine, and just when they've gained Jerry's attention in front, bingo, we drop down behind them." Every man was briefed in detail 3 times as to what the plan was and what was expected of each of them. Brigadier Hill had visited each of his battalions, the 8th, the 9th, and 1 Canberra, to offer encouragement. To his NCOs, he said, "If by any chance you should happen to meet one of these Huns in person, you will treat him, gentlemen, with extreme disfavor."
That's the quote of the night.
Yeah.
If you meet Jerry, meet him with extreme prejudice.
Yes.
Norma, I got to ask about the quote from Eric Bowles. That sounds like a pretty pointed criticism of the airborne plan for Normandy and for Market Garden.
Might have been, yeah.
Well, it seems really on the nose. Like, we're not going to be the carrot this time. My question then is this really the way that airborne should be used? You use them to exploit the already engaged enemy by giving them now someone behind them to have to fight, as opposed to, how they operated in Normandy and how they operated in Holland, where they're effectively this advanced element. Now you use them as an exploitation. Is that?
It's certainly, I think it probably depends on the circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
Because I don't think it would have worked in Normandy to have dropped them,
Right, because you've got to secure the draws and all the artillery batteries.
Yeah. So geography, infrastructure, those kinds of things play into it, into these kinds of decisions.
Mm-hmm.
I would think.
It just seems like it works. I know there's a bad side to Operation Varsity, but it feels like it works. Right?
Yeah, I mean,
tracks.
Part of it is that the Germans by this point were running on fumes.
Yeah.
So you're really dealing with a different animal at this point. Mm-hmm. I would think. Anyway, next slide. So Brigadier Hill's plan was to drop the 2,200 men of his brigade in an area only 800 by 1,000 yards in 6 minutes. Mm. That's a tall order for an airborne drop. But the men of One Canberra could not say enough nice things about the American pilots who pulled it off. It was mostly American pilots who were flying them in. They dropped them on a postage stamp, or the parachute battalion version of a postage stamp. Yeah. Like they all came down where they were supposed to. So they were to drop at 1000 hours, and their drop zone was in a clearing at the north end of Deersforder Wood. So I put a little box around. I don't know if you can see it on there, but there's a wee little box. I should have made the line thicker. Where it says 6th Airborne Division, LZs, LEs. That's where they came down. So their drop zone was in a clearing, the north end of Deersforder Wood, about 6 miles northwest of Basel. And it was very obvious to the enemy as a potential drop zone. But fortunately, earlier in the morning, the German commander, not expecting that there would ever be a daytime drop, had sent some of his men to the river to try and stop the land forces that had been surging over since the night before, because he assumed there would not be a daytime drop. So, psych.
Yeah. Gotcha. So much for all their tactical flexibility and their military brilliance, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. No. So, 8th Battalion was to clear the enemy out of the drop zone, and 9th Battalion was to secure the Schneppenberg Ridge, which was manned by Fallschirmjäger, who were, pretty good troops. And One Canberra was to clear the southwest corner, which was the most densely populated area with several fortified farmhouses and barns from which the enemy was firing. And they were also to take and hold a village and some road junctions in the area. The operation planners had been hopeful that a preliminary aerial bombardment of the region would soften up the German defenses so that the landing would be only weakly opposed, but it didn't work out. It never does. Have you noticed? It never does.
Never. No.
Heavy flak from the ground damaged or destroyed several of the transport aircraft. There was a lot of American air crews that jump masters and pilots lost their lives that day. Major Bob Furlot of One Can Para recalled that that he was actually thrown out of the airplane rather than jumped, because the Dakota he was in was hit by flak and started burning. Veterans remembered the coolness and courage of the pilots, who were so determined to drop their men accurately on the drop zone that they took no evasive action. So here's a quote from Private Hellerud. As we were approaching the drop zone, we were hit in the right engine and tail section, killing the American sergeant jumpmaster. The plane was on fire and losing altitude fast. On the way down, I was able to see the plane hit the ground and burst into flames.
Jesus.
Yeah. Yeah. So they always remembered that and felt pretty bad about it. The battalion descended through heavy fire, with many of the men recalling seeing bullet holes in their parachutes as they descended. That'd be a little unnerving. Major Fraser Eady, with bullets flying all around him, sagged in his harness, pretending to be dead, so the German gunners would direct their fire elsewhere. The landing zone was hot as the British and Canadians landed squarely on top of stiff opposition. The Germans still determined to hold their ground. Several men lay dead or wounded on the drop zone. It was, as expected, chaotic, a lethal no man's land. But the training held firm, and every man displayed the initiative and leadership needed, regardless of rank. This was the secret weapon of the parachute battalions. Their training was such that they could function effectively in battle, whether they had a commanding officer giving them orders or not.
Mm-hmm.
Next slide.
I feel like, Norma, Bowie, I'm going to do that thing where I make my provocative statement of the night, if that's all right.
Go for it.
Sometimes I feel like the unsung, the people who get the most criticism in any of these airborne operations that we've talked about, right? Normandy, it's the air crews. Well, they messed up the drops, and so everybody ends up scattered. Market Garden, it's that they were dropping supplies to the wrong places. There's problems with Husky, and that tows are being released too early. There's all these problems. Mm-hmm. Nobody ever really, I feel like I notices that there's not a lot of credit ever really given to the men of Transport Command who are flying these missions in unarmed aircraft over flak guns and in some cases heavy anti-aircraft batteries that are just blasting away at them. And their only real objective is to safely deliver their troops to the drop zone. And then that's it. Whatever happens to Air Transport Command pilots after that happens to them. I feel like you know what, tonight, Bo, on Homebrew History, we're gonna dedicate this live episode about 1st Canadian Para to Air Transport Command 2, because I feel like they've been almost completely washed over in so much of the narrative. There we go. Definitely. Cheers to that.
Cheers to them. Yeah. And
absolutely.
Operation Varsity is one that's, it's not your D-Day, it's not your Market Garden, but this and Norma, I guess, with the training of 1st Canadian Para, because I can't imagine, being dropped in a hot LZ, much less, in Operation D-Day, being, landed in an area that is foreign to you, and you are without weapons. And I think it's incredibly impressive. And I didn't know this prior to, this episode here, is that, 1st Canadian Para doesn't give up a square inch of land. They don't retreat. I mean, that is impressive. And it's difficult to, instill this amount of training, in these individuals that allow them to do so. And that's just impressive to me.
Well, they were impressive. There's no doubt about that. And they knew it. Don't worry. They were well aware.
Somebody else who's impressive and knows it is the Tattooed Historian. Just wanted to hop in and give a shout out to John Heckman and the Tattooed Historian over there on his YouTube channel, tuning in with us tonight. So
cool.
Great to see him. And looks like you've got a follower here.
Oh, that's my kid.
Hi, Mom.
Jason Giroux, and I'm sorry if I did that
Oh,
wrong.
Jason.
But,
Yeah.
Jason jumps in here to say, I was confident that we were reasonably well prepared. There was an enormous residual self-confidence in the parachute battalion. People don't wonder if they can do things. And that, of course, is from Lieutenant Colonel Hugh Pike, commanding officer 3rd Para British Army during the Falklands War in 1982. But he says that it seems as though the Canadians embodied that attitude.
Hi, Jason. Jason is a good friend of mine.
Well, we are glad to have Jason along with us.
He's awesome. If you ever want to do a segment on urban warfare,
He's our guy.
He's your guy. He
Yes.
is a specialist in urban. He teaches it.
Nice.
But he's studied it extensively. He can give you chapter and verse on Ortona. It's brilliant. Anyway, so next slide, my dears.
Do that.
So these are pictures from Operation Varsity.
Well,
C Company jumped first and immediately assaulted the road junction and farms and achieved their objectives in 30 minutes. This was despite losing their senior leadership. Commander Major John Hanson was injured in the drop, broke his collarbone, and Captain John Clancy was taken prisoner almost immediately, but he later escaped captivity and rejoined the company on April 18th, so about 3 weeks later. 2 sergeants organized the men to secure the objectives. That training kicked in again that empowers every man to lead.
Yeah.
They then dug in and held off sporadic enemy counterattacks for the next 16 hours. B Company's drop zone was very hot, but was brought under control quickly as they overran the buildings that were their objectives and drove the enemy out. Captain Sam McGowan showed up late to the rendezvous point. He was bleeding from a head wound. Fraser Eady saw that there was a hole in the front of his helmet and a hole at the back of his helmet. And he was aghast. And he asked McGowan, "Are you all right?" And McGowan said, "Well, I've got a bit of a headache." Turns out the bullet had gone in the front of his helmet, traveled around the inside rim of the helmet, and gone out the back.
Luckiest man of the year award right there.
Yeah.
Wow.
His luck didn't hold, sadly. But that day he was lucky. A Company landed accurately at the eastern edge of their drop zone and mounted an immediate attack on buildings that were to be used as a battalion headquarters. Enemy resistance was quashed when Company Sergeant Major George Green led a Piat detachment and cleared the houses. He received a DCM, Distinguished Conduct Medal, for his courage and his resourcefulness. Their objectives were all taken and held by early afternoon, though there was still fighting taking place. Sergeant Andy Anderson recalls his great relief when at about 4:30 p.m. he heard the sound of tanks and Bren carriers coming from the direction of the river, the British 15th Division arriving to help with the mopping up. The total casualties for the battle were 28 killed, 35 wounded, and 4 missing. Sadly, one of the killed was the battalion commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Jeff Nicklin. His second in command, Major Fraser Eady, became a lieutenant colonel and led the battalion with courage and resolve for the rest of the war. He had previously acted as a second in command in Normandy after Nicklin was wounded in July of 44. So the men were accustomed to Eady leading them. Fraser Eady said of his battalion, "Once we dropped in on Operation Varsity, the battalion had become purely a professional unit. In my opinion, there was none better."
Jesus. Yeah.
Okay, next slide. And this is quite a story. The only member of 6th Airborne to be awarded a Victoria Cross was a Canadian medical orderly from Toronto, serving with the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion at Operation Varsity. Corporal Fred Topham, called Toppy by his fellow soldiers, was a gentle giant of a man. Originally with Toronto's 48th Highlanders, Toppy was strong and fit from working in the mines of Northern Ontario before the war. Toppy jumped with C Company on March 24th and immediately began clearing casualties off the drop zone. When Toppy saw two men from the parachute field ambulance battalion get shot and killed on their way to pick up a wounded man, he sprang into action and ran to the casualty. Bullets were flying around him, and one laid open his cheek and another hit him in the nose. Can you imagine how much that would hurt?
A lot.
But Fraser Eady recalled that Toppy refused to be evacuated. He went back out there again and again and continued evacuating the drop zone until he had cleared it. It wasn't until then that he finally agreed to sit down and listen to reason and let the doctors work on him. Even then, he refused to be evacuated. That in itself probably would have won him a medal of some kind. But Toppy wasn't done being a hero that day. On his way back to the drop zone after being treated at the aid station, he saw a burning Bren carrier that had received a direct hit. The carrier was packed with mortar ammunition that was ready to blow. Enemy mortar bombs were still dropping all around. There were 3 badly wounded men in the burning vehicle. Despite being ordered by an officer not to approach the carrier, Toppy climbed up on it and lifted each of the men out. Seconds after Toppy leapt off the carrier, it exploded. Although one of the men died of his injuries, 2 survived, and Toppy arranged for their evacuation. He then continued back to join his company. His reaction when he got the news that he was to receive the VC was that he would just lie low and wait for the fuss to die down. He said that he said he'd just done what any man in his outfit would have done. So a very humble hero. So this picture, that's a picture of Toppy. What's that?
That seems to be the type of people that get the VC. Mm-hmm. It's never the ones that say, I'm out to try and get a VC. It's the ones that don't want anything to do with it.
Yeah. Well, Toppy came back to Toronto after the war, and he worked for Toronto Hydro. But he unfortunately died in 1974 of a heart attack. So he's only in his 50s. And the picture on the right here was a plaque unveiled in his honor in 2007. And the gentleman in the burgundy beret there is Jan de Vries, who was one of the veterans. So,
wow.
Yeah. So next slide. This map is by Mike Bechtold.
We know him.
Mike does the best maps of anybody in the world, I'm pretty sure. He makes maps that even I can understand. They are clear and concise, and you can follow them easily. You know, you look at some maps and it's,
what am I looking at?
Yeah, this
spaghetti.
Mike is just, he's so good at it. Anyway, so this is from Mike. First Canberra had truly proved itself in Operation Varsity, but there was more work ahead of them before their war was finished. They were sent eastward across Germany, then north towards the Baltic. This race for the Baltic was not just military, it had become geopolitical as well. Mm-hmm. Churchill foresaw that Stalin would not be held to the Yalta agreements and would seek to impose communism on all territory taken in Eastern Europe. Not to be trusted, in other words. Imagine that. Churchill knew a threat of tyranny when he saw it, and he sent orders direct to 6th Airborne, including 1st Canberra, directing them to make with all speed to the Baltic coast city of Wismar. This city had been allocated to the Soviets at Yalta, but its proximity to the Danish border might have been too strong a territorial temptation for Stalin to withstand. Once the Red Army moved in, it would be almost impossible to dislodge them. And losing Denmark to the Soviets was not a desirable outcome. So that was their objective. They had almost 500 kilometers of enemy-filled territory to cover. Next slide. A pattern of movement was established in the final days of March and first few weeks of April. Private E.H. Jackson said the routine is advance as far as possible for the day, dig in for the night, and hold. We're making about 15 miles per day, rotating with other companies and platoons for the point. Travel was on foot, on trucks, or riding tanks. There was fighting, but it was mostly easily handled, and it was clear that the Germans were giving up the ghost. I mentioned Sam McGowan on March, I think it was March 30th. His company was walking along the road and there was a sudden explosion. And it wasn't an enemy attack. A grenade in Sam's belt had exploded and killed him. And I think that this had a bigger impact on the men than any other death because it was so tragic and pointless. Anyway, he's buried in the Holton War Cemetery. So these pictures are their various conveyances to get to their destination. The one in the center and the bottom there, I don't know if you can see at the very bottom of that picture, he's frying an egg on a tank.
My man.
So yeah.
My man.
Okay.
Resourcefulness.
Yes. Next slide. As they continued towards their goal, the number of German POWs they were taking was becoming a problem. They didn't have the men needed to guard them, food to feed them, or time to question them. This became especially critical when they crossed the Elbe River at the end of April. Not only German soldiers, but German factory workers and their families were streaming by them heading west as the Canadians headed east and the British. The men of 1st Canberra they just told the soldiers to hand over their weapons and keep walking. Their orders were to get to Wismar before the Soviets, and they were determined to fulfill their orders, especially when Brigadier Hill asked them to spearhead the advance. So I guess everybody can read that quote. Yeah, there we are. Yeah, no, go. Yeah, it's fine. Next one. The battalion was able to make good time thanks in part to the tanks of the Royal Scots Greys and the RASC troop carriers. Fraser Eady recalls that his conveyance was being driven by Major Stan Waters, who's the fellow with the beret there on that picture. He said Stan was a Calgary boy and a bit of a cowboy. So he was driving his tank pretty fast. One paratrooper joked, "I never realized a Sherman tank could do 60 miles an hour." That was a bit of an exaggeration, but they traveled 120 kilometers in 12 hours, meeting little resistance. Lieutenant Alf Tucker recalled that they drove through a German armored unit, like right through a German armored unit, and they passed us without doing a thing because they were retreating from the Russians. We went through unit after unit as we drove up. It must have been surreal. There was a dust up with an American unit before the journey to the Baltic ended. Fraser Eady recalled, "We got up to a place called Gadbush, where an American armored regiment decided they were going to cross our line and take our route up to Wismar. I had the brigadier with me, so I was fairly sure of my ground. And I just told the general in charge of that division he'd better turn them around or the battle was going to start right there. We were going on that route. We were going to Wismar. He was on the wrong route, and he should have been going up the main highway. By God, he backed down. So on we went." Fraser Eady, when he got old, had this lovely growly voice. So hearing him say that is just a scream. Okay, next slide. One Canberra and the Royal Scots Greys reached Wismar on May 2nd, just a few hours ahead of the Red Army, and immediately set up roadblocks on the eastern and northeastern sides of the town. They dug in, not knowing how the meeting with the Red Army was going to go. They'd hoped for the best, but they were prepared for the worst. There were still swarms of German troops heading west. Andy Anderson recalled that the pile of weapons taken from the German soldiers as they crossed into Allied-held territory was 25 feet long and 10 feet high. At 4 p.m., C Company, which was covering the bridges at the east side of town, met the first Red Army representative, a Soviet officer of the 3rd Tank Corps of the 70th Army, commanded by Rokossovsky. A Russian officer arrived in a jeep with his driver, noted the battalion war diary. It was quite unofficial because he had no idea that we were in Wismar until he came to our barrier. He had come far in advance of his own column and was quite put out to find us sitting on what was the Russians' ultimate objective. The next day, Sergeant Anderson and a small group that accompanied him were sent with an interpreter as a patrol to make a friendlier contact. First Canberra was blessed with some members who could speak Russian. One example of how being a nation of immigrants was of great benefit. Once the Soviets understood who the Canadians were, there was handshaking, hugs, and the vodka bottle started to appear. Anderson and his group did their level best to keep up with the vodka intake, not wanting to give offense, but they ended up passed out, sick, or both. Anderson barely got them back to their own lines before he was violently ill, which probably saved him from a bad hangover. The relationship continued to be unstable. The Soviets insisted on being allowed past Wismar. At one point, an exasperated Colonel Fraser Eady informed an insistent Russian officer, "One of mine can take 7 of yours any day of the week, and if you don't believe me, try it."
Good luck.
Yeah. The Canadians did their best to follow the divisional directive. Dealings with the Russians will be, as far as possible, governed by a spirit of friendliness and tolerance, tempered with firmness. I guess that Fraser Eady was the firmness. That was easier said than done. Although the Canadians were not allowed past the armed roadblock the Red Army had set up a few dozen yards east of their own, except for one courier jeep a day, the Russians were to be allowed into the city. Russian access to Wismar created nothing but trouble for the Canadians, who were appalled by the behavior and poor discipline of the Soviets. Andy Anderson recalled, "Although we had been briefed on what to look for in terms of uniform, rank, discipline, and so on, we quickly found out that these were largely peasant rabble, terribly undisciplined and determined to get into the city. They at times appeared to be more our enemy than our ally," which was a bit of foreshadowing, I think. Some of the behavior was atrocious, even criminal. One private recalled that the Russians would rape every female between 9 and 90 that they could get their hands on. There was also the flood of displaced persons flooding into the Allied lines, which was another headache for the troops. Mm-hmm. Next slide. So this picture, I love the picture in the top left corner there. It's a Canadian who, I guess he's got a Bren gun, and I suppose he's supposed to be, keeping a weather eye out for trouble, but he was looking pretty relaxed. Mm-hmm. He was chilling. And the picture underneath is a bunch of women in that were displaced people that were coming in ahead of the Russians, I guess, and there's a wagon full of bread in front of them that was the food that they were given to eat. Okay, next slide. Ultimately, the impasse had to be broken by those higher up in the chain of command. There's your buddy. There, Joe.
There he is.
Bernard. Yeah.
On May,
the Monty mug. It's in the storage unit.
On May 7th, General Rokossovsky met with Field Marshal Montgomery in Wismar to discuss a resolution. And Fraser Eady tells a story about how Montgomery, trying to puff himself up to look intimidating, said, "How many armies do you command?" "I command 2. And Rokossovsky said, "I command 7. Well, it was a bit deflating, I suspect. Anyway, it was a political decision to default to the Yalta Accords, and Wismar was to be surrendered to the Russians. The war against Germany ended on May 8th, but the friction at Wismar remained for a few days yet, as the Canadians were tasked with keeping order in the town. John Feduck remembers, when we were told to leave, the people of Wismar begged and cried not to leave them with the Russians. But there was no choice. On May 19th, 1st Canberra and the rest of the 6th Airborne troops left Wismar forever, landing back in Bulford the next night. A few weeks later, the Canadians were on their way home. Next slide. Brigadier Hill praised the Canadians for their role in the fighting trek across Germany, where we more than kept pace with the armored division on our flank, which ended with our battalion, the Canadians, entering the town of Wismar on the Baltic Sea 3 hours ahead of the Russians, as Sir Winston Churchill had personally demanded. So there's a letter there that James Hill wrote to Fraser Eady just after they embarked for home. And that telegram there is from Fraser Eady to his wife saying that he's on his way home. Signed it with love and kisses. He hadn't seen his wife since, 1942. So.
Oh, is that all? Good gracious.
So next slide. Of the men he called my Canadians, Brigadier James Hill later wrote, what splendid ambassadors for their great country they had proved to be, whilst isolated and serving with the 6th Airborne throughout their war in Europe. They were called upon and paid the full price for freedom and service to their country. I thanked the Almighty for the privilege of being their brigade commander. And this picture is of a mountain in the Rocky Mountains in Western Canada that they've renamed Escuelas, which means that's the slogan, I guess, of the Airborne. It means from the sky or from the heavens. So that there's that commemorative naming of a mountain in their honor.
Wow.
Yeah. So there, I'm done.
Norma, I mean, first of all, thank you. Right, this was great. I do want to go back real quick. Back to the ma'am. What do you think that meeting was like? Right? Yeah, you already said it might have been a little deflating for Monty.
A little bit.
I mean, here's a guy, Rokossovsky. He has outlasted Stalin's purges. He's fought against the Germans on the Eastern Front. And here's Monty, equally as determined to destroy the Nazis and bring the war to an end. Here's these two guys having a meeting to determine the geopolitical future of a city. It couldn't have been, and knowing Monty's penchant for the dramatic and the theatrical, what is any good accounts of what the meeting was actually like?
I don't think not that I've found. There may exist such, but I have not seen seen anything other than that remark of Fraser Eady's that he was Fraser Eady was not overly impressed with Montgomery. I'm sorry.
It's okay. There's a lot of people that aren't. But as James McNeil points out, Monty had a bulletproof ego.
Yeah. I just want to say to James, thank you so much. James is in England, so it's going on for 2 a.m. probably there. It's 1 o'clock, 10 after 1 a.m.
Yeah.
James is such a mensch. He stays up late to listen to me blather, and I really appreciate it.
And get a shout out here from Susan Yu. This is great research and storytelling. James says first class. And
Thanks,
Jason jumps in to say, as a qualified paratrooper, military historian, and more importantly, a friend of Norma's, I quite enjoyed her review of 1 Canberra Battalion. Thank you, Norma. And homebrew history, Escuelas. So that felt good.
Really appreciate you showing up there, my friend.
Norma, we got one question for you. It does come from Jason. I'm curious if Norma found any evidence discussing the relationship between 1st Canadian Para Battalion and with British paratroopers in general. Good, bad, bit of both. Damned colonials, or generally liked?
well, actually, that letter from James Hill at the end there, he states there that there was never a moment's friction between the British battalions and the Canadians. They got along great. He did say that there was a noticeable difference between them. I have a quote from him. He says, this was on June 4th, 1944, so that, right before D-Day. All day long, the Canadians with whom I'd pitched my tent were playing games, throwing a ball around, and I thought, what tremendous vitality these Canadians have got. Then in the afternoon, I would visit my English battalions and find half a dozen chaps kicking a football and the rest asleep. I thought to myself, here's the difference between the old world and the new, the élan and joie de vivre of the new world of Canadians, and the maturity and the not worrying, not bothering, and having a good nap while we can of the British. So that, but yeah, James, I mean, I don't know if James Hill was smoothing over some rough edges, but he stated that that they got along great. There was a moment that could have flared into a problem on D-Day when like the couple of guys, including Dan Hardigan, were trying to find their way back to where they were supposed to be from wherever they'd landed. And they kind of washed up with a lieutenant from 9th Battalion who went to Colonel Otway, they were waiting to go up against the Merville Battery. And the lieutenant said to Otway, I've brought a couple of Canadians. And Otway said, well, what good are they? What do they know? They don't know anything. And what he meant was he had trained his 9th Battalion to a fairly well. They had really intense training over what they were going to do. And the Canadians hadn't been part of that because that wasn't part of their remit for this operation. But, and then they took it rather badly. So the Private Mellon that Hardigan was with said, we know just as much as any bloody limey. But and apparently there was dead silence. Like
it could have gotten out of hand.
Apoplectic, like that this guy would talk back to him. But that's the only sort of very minor bit of friction that I have discovered, and it's more they seem to get along fine.
Now, Bo, before we say ta-ta, you know what it's time for. It's time for that awkward moment where everybody sits really quiet while I talk for about 40 seconds. But did you know that Homebrew History is brought to you by Civil War Trails? Civil War Trails, the world's largest outdoor museum. Get out there and make some history of your own. Snap a signed selfie. Use the hashtag signed selfie and tag Civil War Trails in any of your posts on social media to help keep spreading the word about the world's largest outdoor museum with 1,600 different sites all across the country. Check out the links in the show notes and the descriptions of this episode once it goes into the archived video section. And you can do us a favor, click over on the link for Civil War Trails and order yourself some paper maps for your next road trip across the country. That way you can follow yourself along your own Civil War Trail. You want to support Homebrew History, head over to our Buy Me a Coffee page where you can get access to live streams like this because this one is public. But very soon, very, very soon, my friends, it will be moving over to Buy Me a Coffee. And that's going to be the only way that you can get it. So become a member for $5. $5 simple dollars a month gets you access to wonderful scholars, wonderful historians just like Norma to come here and talk about fascinating topics of all of your whims and desires. Our designs are by the Bearded Historian. You can see his logo right there. And right there on my hat, he made me the fox head, my Sherwood Rangers Yeomanry baseball cap. I'm officially decked out in nothing but British militaria today. I didn't plan that when I woke up, but here we are. So go down to the Bearded Historian's website. Check out his Etsy page. There you can find some more designs. Homebrew History now airs weekly. You can catch us every Monday except when we don't upload the episode on time because we forgot. But yes, every week you will get an episode of Homebrew History every single week. Now, bringing it back to Bo and Norma, who sat patiently and not at all awkwardly to my side while I did that. For my favorite, for Bo's favorite segment.
Yes.
Boo-hickey.
So Norma.
Norma got excited. You saw that?
Yes, I know. I'm excited that she's excited. Okay, so what boohickey is something that is either misinterpreted, something that is just absolute rubbish, something that is just completely wrong, that people, have this sort of fascination of mythos that is clearly not founded in any good historiography. So what is something that you want to dispel? What is a myth about First Canadian Para that you want to dispel now? What's the boohickey?
Well, it's more sort of generally about Canadians.
Okay.
We're not that nice. I mean, we're nice until we're not.
And until someone pushes you.
Some of the toughest, meanest soldiers in either of the world wars were Canadians.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and I have a quote. Which might dispel some of the myths around Canadian politeness. A couple of quotes, actually. One is, I read recently that a woman was remembering her grandfather, who was in, I guess, probably the Air Force. And when he was serving, and he was going down to the pub, he always took a Canadian with him because they were good in a bar fight. And an unnamed American officer, and this is a quote, said, "If fuck and frontal were removed from the military vocabulary, the Canadian Army would have been both speechless and unable to attack."
That's the quote of the night.
Oh my God. Amazing. I love that.
Yeah, that's one of my favorites, so when you hear Canadians dropping F-bombs, we have a proud tradition of dropping F-bombs.
It's just like a little salt and pepper. You just kind of use it everywhere to spice a few things up.
It's a noun, it's a verb, it's an adjective, it's
It's a sentence versatile. Flavor enhancer, Bo. You told me about that.
It's versatile. Yeah.
Oh my goodness. All right.
I love boohickey, by the way. Boohickey is my new favorite word.
Thank you.
Look at that, Bo. You're spreading the gospel, just a different.
I know. I've told Joey this. I'm kind of scared of what's in here because sometimes it comes out of here. That's what. I'm glad you like it.
I do.
I'm gonna be polite and throw it to Norma. This is Homebrew History, where we've all got a drink in our hand. So, what is in your cup?
Well, it's just water, I'm afraid, because I'm old and I'm trying to nurse along whatever few brain cells I have left.
Well, I think you did marvelously with us. So,
but I do have it in my Dam Buster mug.
There we go.
Did you know that 30 of the members of the Dam Buster crews were Canadian?
Mm-hmm. I do now.
I knew that only because it's in the book Dam Busters by friend of the show, James Hall.
James Hall, yeah. Dropping everybody.
I figured we'd work there eventually. Bo, how about yourself?
Yeah, so there's only, and Joey knows my problem with medical doctors.
You better be drinking Canadian Scotch.
Not this time. Someone who listens to the show should. My address is 147. You can send it my way. No, but unfortunately, I actually have something that's kind of close. Dr. McGillicuddy's. They are a Michigan-based company. And Dr. McGillicuddy's makes a fine blackberry whiskey. So that is what I've been sipping on. That is what is in my cup. And that was what was in my cup. And as you can clearly see, I've been drinking all evening to First Canadian Para, so it is now dry. But that was what's in my cup. How about yourself, Joey?
That sounds really good.
It is really good.
I say bon. Just
It is very good.
You're making me
hate
rethink my my non-drinking.
I do what I can.
Well, Bo, I'll let you down as usual. But Norma, hey, I'm here to help you out with, hey, I've had lemon, ginger, and manuka honey green tea. So that was what was in there. There we go. I've let Bo down yet again.
I'm the resident alcoholic over here.
What can I say? Norma, I so enjoyed this discussion. I think it's timely, right? With geopolitical crises the way that they are today.
Yeah.
And blathering mouths saying things about Canada, and I thought it would be timely to do a whole series on why you shouldn't screw around with the Canadians.
Yeah.
World War I, World War II, and First Canadian Para. I feel like we're the great kind of way to tie all that up. So thank you for participating in Canada at War Week. And thanks to all of you who tuned in tonight. James says that you were channeling your inner Scott. And Susan says, I need Canadian gear. Well, if you're buying. But I think we'll finish with that one. Bravo, Norma. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Susan. Thanks, guys. It's been a slice.
And viewers, you can catch up with us, and you can go back and watch this on the replay starting tomorrow. Bo, until next time.
Yep.
Cheers, everybody.
Cheers, everybody.
Here's to ya.